and feed their proposal towards one side. The engagement, there's many ways through which nonviolent movements can engage in a peace process, but the example I'm looking at, which I find fascinating and is quite unknown, is the peace movement in the Basque Country and how it has transformed from being a protest movement for peace to become a proactive movement that is making proposals, that is pushing for dialogue, that becomes one side of dialogue, and that eventually becomes an agent and a guarantor of peace. And it's a picture of the artisans for peace that were very instrumental in enforcing and helping the ETA organization to disarm and to dismantle itself 2 years ago. And finally, nonviolent action. So really, we always think about nonviolent movements as playing roles in provoking a peace process, but then we're not really sure whether they continue to mobilize on the streets while these processes happen. And we've heard a really powerful story about the Liberian women this morning. There's many other examples. The one on the picture on the top, on the bottom right, is Madhesi groups in Nepal and how they try to use nonviolent action, including sometimes called that as rioting, because of the very forceful actions they took to try and have their demands, such as federalism, included in the negotiations. Now, what happens in terms of the impact of these different tactics? And here the story is not very positive, I have to say, and I was trying to picture kind of a move towards, well, starting from a massive impact on the onset of peace processes and on keeping the momentum for the peace process to conclude into an agreement, to having some sort of impact on the content of these agreements, sometimes having demands directly included into the content. Very little influence, unfortunately, on the implementation of these talks. We've heard this morning in Liberia how women were instrumental in bringing a peace, and then they were not there to implement it. And then some form of remobilization, usually by a new generation after a few years, when they realized that the mobilization that they had didn't lead to too much impact, and where they take down the streets again and use a lot of the energy and the legacy that has been built throughout mobilization. And I'll end on a few preliminary highlights, I would say, from the research. Some of them positive and many of them negative. So I'm just going to read them. The first one is positive. Movements can use nonviolent action and can use their social legitimacy to force parties to the dialogue table or to become a key dialogue interlocutor. More negatively, movements are rarely prepared for strategic engagement during peace processes to avoid being bypassed or co-opted by elite pacts. And I think we'll probably discuss that further on the panel. Thirdly, governments prefer to negotiate with armed groups than with grassroots social movements, and I've seen that many times. They find it much easier. The guys with the guns, they know how to find them. They know they can maybe co-opt them or they can bring them along much easier than grassroots movements. There is not one strategy that guarantees influence and sustained mobilization. So of all of the modes I have described, I didn't find one which was more helpful, unfortunately. Mediators can do harm and disempower nonviolent movements by shifting social dynamics on the ground. And I've found some examples of that, of mediators coming in, not understanding the local dynamics really well, looking for the guys with the guns, and transforming what the context is on the ground if they haven't done their analysis right. And finally, I wanted to end on a positive note. The legacy of nonviolent movements can help hold elites accountable and lay the groundwork for reconciliation efforts. So I'll end here, and now we'll hear some more real stories from conflict places. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronique. That was an awesome set of framing remarks for our conversation today. And I would say, too, the challenges and the opportunities that she reflected at the end, we heard when we met a few months ago at the UN Mediation Support Unit, who are kind of reflecting on both the challenges of engaging with movements, but also the huge opportunities and possibilities to advance their work in a positive way. So thank you so much for kicking us off. Now to Palwasha. So what does people power mean in the Afghanistan context, and how are these movements informing or influencing the peace process there?
There's a lot to cover, and I'll try my best to cover. I have my notes with all these arrows going all different directions. But actually, I called up some of my friends in Afghanistan who are part of the women's movement, and I said, you know, I'm going to be asked this question: what does people power mean in Afghanistan? And how do I answer that question? What does it mean to you? Unfortunately, the first thing I heard was, it means guns. and how guns have been used to really empower people at the local level for their voices, and how it's become militarized. And how people power can be also dangerous words associated with the past communist regimes. And so those are some of the things that first came out. But after that, there was a lot more positive. One of the things that was on everybody's mind at this point is the current elections that just happened last Saturday. And so some of them said, well, it means voting power. It means that we actually went out in face of the Taliban, in face of those who were stopping us by violence, and we went out and voted. So that's another thing that came up. But in terms of how many ways people in Afghanistan have organized, it's incredible. There are so many different movements at local levels that have tried to move up to the national level. One of the things that my friends noted was that a lot of these movements are happening within this government structure. So they are protesting for change within the government. They're civic movements. There are examples of youth movements, the Tabassum movement, the Enlightenment movement, the Uprising for Change movement. There are movements on social media. And these protests for change have been able to actually pressure the government to change different ministers, different different officials in the government. There's also, because of the youth that they've been so active, the government has also been working with the youth and bringing them into the government. So we do have a lot of youth in politics. And in the government, and that is what they were calling more the intellectual movement there. But unfortunately, we do also have movements in the rural areas that are radical groups that are organizing youth around whether it's the Taliban or whether it's other radical groups. And so that's something to also recognize. So you have those that are within the government power structure that are working for change and have protest, and those that are sort of outside and protesting and against the government and radical groups. One thing I did want to talk about quickly is the role of women. In Afghanistan, the women's movement have been way ahead of the game, especially as it relates to the peace process. There were women protesting when the Bonn Agreement was happening. There were women protesting right up in the beginning of the formation of this new system of government post-Taliban, where they were saying, we're not being inclusive enough. We don't have all of the parties at the table. This isn't going to be a sustainable peace process. We need to have everybody at the table. There were women who have been keeping their eyes on the ball, saying, when we do sit down and negotiate with the Taliban, we want to be present. And so they have been working to find ways to make sure that they are a part of that process, whether it is through making sure that they're trained or whether it is making sure that they're organized. And so they have been doing a series of conversations in all of the provinces in Afghanistan to build consensus around what their role in the peace process would be, and how locally they would be able to respond and take action at the local level, as well as contribute to a national level process. And through this conversation at the local level, there have been a series of declarations that have come out, where they worked with the First Lady to come out with a series of declarations for each province in terms of what the women's demands are for the peace process. But also with the Afghan Women's Network, they worked to identify delegates from areas under the Taliban, from victims, to be present. And they're way ahead of all of the other political groups and the men in terms of preparing their delegates and having them ready to be able to participate in any kind of dialogue that came up. So that's another thing. And thirdly, I want to talk about religious leaders. Religious leaders have organized, and they, 2 years ago, they very quietly organized among themselves to build consensus around a fatwa that delegitimizes the Taliban's jihad. And they worked very quietly so that at least 5,000 different institutions and leaders were able to come together and sign a document that issued a fatwa from all the religious leaders in Afghanistan against or opposing the Taliban jihad and their declaration of jihad against the government in Afghanistan. So that's another way that the religious leaders have been organizing in their movements to contribute to the peace process. And they also came up with a declaration of how they would like to be part of the national level peace process if it moves forward. Finally, I wanted to talk about the People's Peace Movement, which is often sometimes called the Helmand Peace Marchers. This has been ongoing for the past 2 years, and it actually started with an attack in Helmand where many people died, both from the Taliban attack and from the government response to that attack. And as some of the marchers explain it, it started because they saw so many women crying in the streets, crying publicly over how many had died, how many of their sons and how many of their relatives had died. And there were also women who went and sat in tents and protested and told the stories of the deaths of their children by both government and Taliban, showing that atrocities were on both sides. And so this inspired a group of young men to band together and to march by foot during the month of Ramadan when they were fasting, to go both to the government and to the Taliban and demand a ceasefire and demand an end to the violence. So they marched towards the Taliban first, Taliban stronghold, and the Taliban told them, no, first you have to get agreement from the government. Then they went to Kabul and marched to Kabul. They were successful. The president announced that he would like to have a ceasefire, and then they went to the Taliban again. And in the midst of all this back and forth, Ramadan ended, and we had a 3-day ceasefire, the 3 days of Eid after Ramadan. And so they were able to push this. It was interesting, some of their stories reflect on when they did talk to the Taliban, some of the Taliban foot soldiers said, we would like to join you. And in showing how many of the Taliban foot soldiers actually went out of the mountains that they were in, out of the rural areas into the cities and sort of flooded, it showed how much they were thirsty for peace. And they took selfies with the police commanders, and women welcomed them with garlands and tried to talk to them about this new Afghanistan that they wanted to create, where there was respect for women's rights. So in that way, there was some connection to a very short-lived ceasefire, and they were successful. And they continued to march. Some of the peace marchers, unfortunately, were arrested by the Taliban. One of them was tortured for over 27 days and was only released because the community pushed for his release. And he was threatened, and when he went back to the march, his family was arrested, unfortunately. And so there are these kinds of tactics that are trying to undermine this movement currently. So we do have this People's Peace Movement. We have youth movements in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, some of the youth movements have been taking on more of an ethnic stratification, where some of the movements are organized by certain ethnic groups and not others. And we have women who are crossing the ethnic divides and are able to organize in preparation for peace talks and to pressure different political parties towards the table to be at peace talks. And we have the religious leaders who are also organizing with statements to go against the jihad, to delegitimize the jihad and support the ceasefire and peace movements in Afghanistan.
Palwasha, thank you so much for that very comprehensive overview of the various movements that are probably not making headlines, let's say, when it comes to the discussion about the peace process in Afghanistan, but I think are critical actors in that process. So thank you. We will now turn to Aden, who will talk with us about what movements look like in Ethiopia and how he sees their role in this now nascent and very significant transition to democracy in the country.
Thank you. So I'll also try to kind of be quick, but I think there's a lot to cover in this context. So I'll talk about Ethiopia. But I've been working in this eastern Ethiopia region called the Somali region of Ethiopia, where we've been supporting these peace talks between the government and an armed opposition group. So the changes in Ethiopia turned out to be different in this particular context, which is something that I'll come back to. But to start with, a bit of a background. I think the protest movements that you saw in Ethiopia in 2014 to 2018 that led to the election or selection of a new prime minister who has opened up the political and the economic system in Ethiopia came from a long history of particularly with this current system of more than kind of 15 years of kind of civil and political space that has been closed. So it started with 2005 when there was what was generally considered free and fair elections, which was disputed, and then the government killed protesters, and then there was violence, and then the opposition guys were jailed. The political system, the space started closing down. So you might remember there was a civil society law model along the Russian kind of NGO law that restricted funding for civil society. The media crackdown was also one of the things that was installed at that particular time. Then there was anti-terrorism legislation. All the armed opposition groups were banned. All the movements, anyone who was against the government was labeled as a terrorist, including bloggers and kind of social media people. So it was, there was kind of crackdown on kind of all forms of protest. And it was not just the elections, there was also the teachers protested, they cracked down. The Muslims, there were big protests by Muslim leaders because the government went after the Muslim leaders who were opposed to a particular form of Islam that the government was trying to impose. Again, another heavy crackdown, thousands of people were sent to jail. Then there was a social media-based group called Zone 9 bloggers. Then they labeled as terrorists and then arrested. So all kind of avenues were blocked. That was coupled with weakening of the armed insurgents. So the insurgents have also been weakening. The armed opposition groups have been weakening over time because the government had, they had this anti-terrorism law, but also they were working with other states, the neighboring states. In the case of Kenya, they had a network there that they could kidnap the opposition guys. The government, Ethiopian government, invaded Somalia, which was the base for some of the armed. So there was both civic space and the armed opposition space were both closed down. So the government was fully in control of kind of everything at that particular time. And then, but that was also coupled with 20 or something years since this current government, EPRDF, the Ethiopian People Democratic Revolutionary Front, came to power. They instituted what they call ethnic federalism, which led to opening up of these states, regional states. People can learn in their own language. Oromia, where was the kind of the backbone of the protest, had their own language. The schools, people were educated in their own language. There was massive expansion of universities. So there was this crackdown, but there was also this other space that was also opening up with kind of thousands of students coming out of university. So that is the background. So what happened in 2014 was ethnic protests started in Ethiopia. They were mainly initially focused in towns where there were universities. So the students, the students have always been the backbone of civic movements in Ethiopia. So the universities were kind of, the towns with the universities were where most of the protests happened. And then the trigger for that particular protest was the government kind of coming up with what they called the Addis Ababa master plan, which was the city was expanding into these neighboring areas, which was mainly, again, dominated by the Oromo ethnic group. So massive land grabs, no compensation at all. So these were largely non-militant movements. These were just students protesting. They came out to the streets. There were some attacks on kind of farms and foreign-owned farms and kind of state offices, but these were largely kind of unarmed opposition movements. There wasn't any kind of strong links with any of the kind of organized opposition movements at any time in that, because these were kind of organic, home-based kind of movements, mainly led by students. So the futures, so the second point I wanted to mention was what were the futures of these particular movements? So there was kind of a lack of what I called here centralization. So there was no strong or kind of prominent leaders in these movements. This was a lesson that they learned from the previous movement. So the government, when the teachers protested, when the Muslim protested, the bloggers, they went after the leadership. So this was a movement that had to become leaderless because they were responding to the crackdown of the government. So and it has implication afterwards on that, but this was kind of in response to what the government has done previously. So it was a leaderless movement. There was targeting, another feature was this targeting of state institutions and officials. Some were violent, but others was trying to get states, officials, and institutions out of the zones where these protests were moving. That comes from because the state has always used security forces and other state institutions, and this is it's a state that has monopolized what you consider kind of all spaces. There was fusion of there's something I called here, kind of for every 5 people there was one who was a spy for the government. So you could imagine like they kind of militarized and kind of controlled everything. So the movements had to kind of get rid of all state officials, anyone associated with these movements, because if you coexist with them, then they're likely to spy on you. So that was another kind of feature. And also worth mentioning that the party, so every state official had to become part of the party. So you can imagine kind of, I think there were 5 million members of the party who were also part of the government state infrastructure. There were accusations of kind of donor programs, sometimes even being used to bankroll some of the state officials. So you can imagine the state was kind of, they had to get rid of these state structures in a way to kind of get that space in themselves. Then 2 other things in terms of features before I move to the peace process that happened afterwards. The other one was social media. So this was corresponding to a time when kind of the space for social media was also increasing. So they were able to post some of their videos and photos in these places. They also had some diaspora kind of support. There's a guy based in Minnesota who is called the president of the protest. So they had connections there. These people were able to post some of the photos in there. As I said, they had a strong ethnic connection as well, because all other avenues were closed. So it was ethnicity that was kind of the main basis for the protest. So, but what happened was the government, as Veronique was describing, the movement led to government making changes. So the prime minister resigned, a new prime minister was put in post, but then the process of negotiation, of course, they didn't negotiate with the movement because the movements were leaderless. So no opportunity for them to kind of have any structured dialogue. So what the government did with the new prime minister was they started negotiating with other opposition movement who have been in exile. These guys, of course, had connections with this movement. They come from the same ethnic group, but they don't represent the same interests and kind of same issues. So at the moment, there hasn't been any kind of particular, I mean, the prime minister, of course, have made some of the changes and some of the things are driven by what the demands of the movement were, but there's no connection in terms of kind of what has happened in terms of the political process and between the movements. And lastly, there have been kind of regional variations in these movements. In the Ogaden region, the Somali region of Ethiopia, where most of our work has been, there wasn't any opportunity for protests to happen because the state or the president that was in control of this region had a strong security institutions. They put thousands of people in jail. There was no space at all for people to even join these protests at all. But luckily, what happened was with the changes and the new prime minister, the previous president was sent to jail, and the guy who replaced him was part of this human rights movements, although he lived in exile, and who is now the president. So although the protests that were happening in Addis and in Oromia didn't actually translate into the movements becoming part of government, it translated into the political changes in this other place where actually the movement was not that strong. So I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the details.
Thanks very much, Anna. That was super helpful, especially this whole question of when do movements become part of governments and when is that helpful, when is that less helpful, which has been a question with a lot of the other movements that we've been discussing, Venezuela, Nicaragua, elsewhere, Sudan. So thank you for that helpful overview. So now we're going to turn to Nadine, who's going to talk a bit about the role of education and training in bridging nonviolent action and peace building.
Great. Thank you, Maria. Thank you also for all the stories so far. I'm going to take this in a little bit of a different direction because I come from a different background of trainer, educator, practitioner, activist, organizer, artist. So And the first thing I think I'm going to do, because we've been sitting a little while, is just really quickly, I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to give you all 15 seconds of it. I want you to turn to your neighbor, and I'd like you to think about what role education and training has played in the work that you do as an organizer, as an activist, as whatever. Think about 1 word or 2 words that might describe the role education and training plays in your work. You got 15 seconds. Go. Sorry.
Do you want to go directly into your slides?
Yeah.
You have to.
Good.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. That was really short. But here we go. Hi, everybody. We're going to come back together. Thank your partner. Hi.
Okay.
I got it.
I guess my role is to bring back the conversation.
Hi. Hi, everybody. That was too short. Excellent. I invite you to continue it in a moment when we get done with our presentations, and there'll be a lot more, hopefully, fruitful conversations now that you've met your neighbor. So I'm going to talk really briefly about my experience from my perspective, thinking that training and education is the answer no matter what the question is asked, which is what I told Maria when she invited me to do this. So on your screen, you can see a picture of the SNAP guide that Maria mentioned, the Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peacebuilding Toolkit, if you will, and the first page of the table of contents to give you an idea of where we're going with this work. And when I think about training and education, and I think about nonviolent action and peacebuilding, it turns out, and in writing this with Lisa Shirk, who's in the back there, what we figured out is that the essential thread of all of this is actually strategic conflict analysis and assessment, and that strategic planning is very clearly what connects nonviolent action and what people call formal peace building. So I'm going to apologize already ahead of time for using these terms without really defining them. Whatever you think they are works for the moment, I'm sure. But what we're talking about is what does an integrated training look like? How do we as activists, as movement people in the ground, actually access the skills and resources in both fields so that we can be ever more effective with the limited resources that we have? And it looks like, here, this is what we think it looks like. No, yeah. We'll go here first. So this is what we think it looks like. We think it looks like interactive training exercises that help people understand strategic movements, basically, the strategic frameworks of movements. And in this work, we've chosen to use the backbone for this analysis as the curl diagram developed by Adam Curl. And in this picture, you can actually see people in 2 different trainings in Kenya using a very large-scale example where we are trying to understand a real-life example of, in this case, Liberia. What happened in Liberia? How did they go from a very unbalanced power situation to a more balanced power situation, from a low awareness of the problems and solutions to the problems to a high awareness of what the problems are and solutions, moving along a pathway from unjust and violent society to a more just and peaceful society, and hopefully more sustainable future. So when we look at that, I'll show you the other picture. This is actually from one of the trainings we did, and you can see it's in Arabic and English, where we were working in Sudan and South Sudan and East Africa. So I think it's really important to think about how a framework like this can help us get away from talking about nonviolent action as one field and peace building as another field, and understand that when you see a pathway like this, you can understand that certain tactics are more accessible, more useful, more effective at different stages in the work that we're doing. And in particular, how do we shift power from those of us who see problems and issues to those of us and then want to make change, and how do we gain the power to make that change over time? You might hear, for example, I mean, part of this work helps us talk about how we level playing fields for negotiations, how we use what typically are considered peace-building tools like dialogue or communication to actually build our movements in the street. Because, you know, when people think of, when you say peace-building in this room, people are clear, the first thing that will pop up is probably a picture of people around a table talking into microphones like this at a formal setting, rather than how do we actually build the small teams, the affinity groups, and the autonomous clusters that are going to take the street in safe and effective ways. Those skills are equally valuable in both places, and I would argue essential in both places. So you might hear nonviolent action stakeholders or nonviolent action practitioners in the street dissing people who are going straight to formal negotiations as sellouts. You might hear peace builders angrily maligning street activists for making matters worse, creating disruption. Anybody ever heard those things? If you don't raise your hand, you're probably lying, but that's okay. So what we're talking about is, the reality is, without some kind of strategic conflict assessment, we don't know where we are on this curve, and we don't actually know where to spend our limited people, power, resources, money, et cetera. And so to me, the simple way to think about it is to integrate training and education into the work that we do, and understand that this is a spectrum of skills that are useful in different points on our pathway to a sustainable peace and justice. Let's see. I think that maybe I'll stop right there. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. And I should note, too, that the other co-author of the SNAP Guide is Lisa Shirt, who is probably... Oh, who's there? So it's been a joy working with Lisa and Nadine, both to bring together the SNAP Guide and to work with activist organizers and peace builders out in the field and see how they have been adapting it and using it for their purposes. So thank you, Nadine, very much for that overview. So just to start the conversation, we'll turn soon to the audience. So I wanted to ask, based on kind of your initial reflections, how, because it seems to be a challenge in this engagement that mediators or negotiators may want to have with grassroots movements to better engage them, to involve them in peace processes, yet we know that's very difficult and challenging. So I wanted to ask you, how can grassroots movements or leaders of movements, how can they better position themselves to participate meaningfully in peace processes based on the challenges that you identified? And I'll open that. Do you want to start, Veronique?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question. A few ideas. Firstly, this importance, and in my presentation, I didn't have time to talk about how movements tend to completely demobilize while the peace process happens because they like, okay, we're going to wait and see what happens and if it's something that we can support or not. So the importance of preparing for keeping the space for mass action, not putting all eggs into one basket and thinking we want to be at the table, but thinking what is more effective for us actually to be at the table, but in a meaningful way. There's been so much talk now about inclusion. I think mediators all are very into inclusive processes. So I think this means that movements can really be more pushy and say, you know, if we're going to be invited, then we're going to have a real voice. Otherwise, we prefer to actually influence from the outside through extra institutional nonviolent action and so forth. Strategic preparation planning for me also involves thinking about, okay, what are the concrete demands that we want to make? Not have these maximalist kind of goals, but something very concrete that we think we can get. Thinking about if we are invited, who can be our mediators? How can we better prepare them? Our negotiators, how can we better prepare them to be effective negotiators? How can we ask for formats that are more inclusive, like national dialogues, where we can really have a meaningful voice? How can we build better coalitions? How can we engage the uncivil society that can push back? I mean, Colombia and other places and Guatemala, and make sure that we win allies in the uncivil space of society and also among the elites. So yeah, initial ideas, there's a lot definitely that can be done.
Those are great ideas. Thank you. Veronique, others?
I sort of covered one of the examples of how the women were thinking strategically about how they might be part of the process by going to trainings to make sure that they were seen as well-trained negotiators themselves, working on understanding how ceasefires work so they could themselves be ceasefire experts, experts at monitoring peace agreements so they could be, so they were seeing like what are the places where they might insert themselves in this process and preparing themselves to be part of that process, and being those that are trained and well-equipped to do that work. They were also consulting among themselves to prepare, what exactly their red lines would be, what are some of the things that they would want to negotiate at the table, and they were also preparing who would be their representatives. They were laying out all kinds of different ideas on the table that if the U.S. Taliban talks would continue, that they would form an independent delegation themselves, not government, not political leaders, just women, and they would go and they would talk to the Taliban, and they would talk to the U.S. negotiators, and they would talk to governments that are different governments that are involved. So they are thinking ahead in terms of how they might insert themselves and preparing for that at different stages and at different levels, both working with the grassroots and connecting those voices to the top.
Thanks, Pawasha. Auden?
I think the reality in some of the context, or Ethiopia especially, I think is the reality is these movements are normally strong, or they can be more visible when there's no organized this other organized group like parties, opposition groups. That's when they thrive. I think when the space opens and these groups come back, then you're faced with the reality of like we are outfoxed. These guys are, they've spent 30 years, 40 years of their life kind of talking about how to become a government, how to form one. So the question, I think the part of the answer is probably they need space and kind of time to actually think about these things. I mean, these movements in the case of Ethiopia, although there have been other movements and series of uprising over time, they really come together quickly. You have no time to kind of form your ideas. They're mostly local-based issues. You're not interested even at national level issues. So the question there then is, yes, space and time, but also maybe thinking about kind of a long-term kind of engagement. You will probably be outgunned in the immediate kind of process, but making sure that maybe in the initial transition, you're going to be marginalized, but you know that you've got another 5 years, 10 years time to kind of organize yourself. But it's a different kind of terrain, I think, when it comes to some of these contexts we're talking about.
Oh, thanks, Auden. And when you're in the moment, it's very hard to have that kind of long-term, a 5 to 10-year perspective when you're facing challenges, repression, and the like. But it's a really good point to be able to carve out the space to be able to think and plan longer term. That's probably music to your ears, Nadine.
Of course it is. I mean, when we look at the success of conflict transformation work, we look at whether or not these groups adhere to nonviolent action when they're in the streets or during mediation, formal mediation processes. We look at whether or not there is unity or solidarity between groups, it's really about sheer numbers and people involved. And we also look then about the ability to plan, or that allows us to train and to prepare people. And there's a few things that really jumped out at me. If we're thinking about the numbers that we need to actually move, governments, militaries, cultural norms, not only are we talking about the famous 3.5% mobilization, right, but we're also talking about how do we build unity and solidarity across deeply entrenched divisions. And we heard already this morning talk about this. And whether you're talking about the United States or whether you're talking about Ethiopia or wherever we're talking about it, we know that one of the things we have to do is help level the playing field, help marginalized groups understand their power and their agency, and help people figure out how to be more effective on the playing fields that they can be effective in, and to take it. And so I love talking to people about leaderless movements. In fact, I don't use that term. They're leader-full movements. We are full of leadership, which is just not hierarchical. One person, you take them out, the movement's gone. So we really do embrace how do we create the potential that and the capacity so that we can make good decisions in multiple leaderful situations. And we have autonomous groups that can take action, that can function on some kind of basic agreement, consent based on visions and values so that we're moving in the same direction, but we can work in a way that's appropriate for the groups that are taking action. And all of this stuff, from very basic things about how we take care of each other to set up support networks for people who are going to be in the street and then maybe need childcare, something as tangible as that, to thinking about what are the big demands that we're going to come together in, a big strategic planning process, I think is all very much part of the work that has to happen to take this higher thinking and make it a reality for people to implement in their lives. And I think it's really important for USIP and Alliance for Peacebuilding and other groups that are supporting this work to figure out how to expand the training outside of the usual circles, the education and the capacity building outside of the usual circles, so we can ever build those numbers who are moving on this path together. And that will help us be more effective. And training and education and planning allows us to practice and to rehearse, if you will, how we make decisions together and prepare for this moment when other people have been preparing for decades on how they're going to implement a new government or infrastructure, and we ourselves need to be ready as well. So I'll just end there.
Thanks very much, Nadine. So the one last question, which if you can address in 1 to 2 sentences, that would be wonderful. And then we'll have a discussion with the audience. So what would be your advice to external actors, whether they're from the UN Mediation Support Unit or governments, other outside actors, and how to better engage with movements as part of a peace process?
Sorry, I'm going to need 4 sentences.
Okay.
But I'll focus on the mediators maybe. And one of the things I've read, for instance, in the UN guidance on effective mediation, it talks about inclusion, and it says, well, social movements are important, but it's hard to identify their leaders, so we don't really know how to approach them. So there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from that in terms of better understanding social dynamics on the ground. I've seen great examples of how, like in a place like Aceh, which I haven't talked about, they did surveys in 1999 and asking who are the people that best represent you, and actually it was all civil society, and then none of them were at the table the next year. So there's a lot that can be done. So listening, supporting, training, supporting, building coalitions and space and time that is required. And if I have to finish, I would say, get these mediators to take the SNAP training and to read, wild civil resistance work, and to come to the AFP, listen about movement mindsets and better understand what this is all about.
All right, I'll give you your $20 out.
Yeah. So let's see, how do I say this? in the Afghanistan context, what the women that I've talked to said that people from the outside need to be very careful when they come in, because there are movements and there are voices on the ground, and they should pay attention to those voices and support those voices in ways that doesn't delegitimize them. And so I think that's something to pay attention to, because if outsiders come in and somehow take credit or somehow focus on certain groups and not others, they can delegitimize those groups and their voices on the ground. And so they said, say this very loud and clear, listen to the local voices, understand that there are local voices that are doing a lot of this peace work, support those local voices, and ask them how they need the support, whether they want you to be loud and vocal about it or whether they want you to be quiet and supporting quietly.
Incredibly important principle for engagement with movements and, frankly, all local actors. Aden?
I'll say I think externals should avoid kind of turning this into a bit of like a structure, because I think the way we normally work is like you work with an NGO proposal. I think this is a flexible model, it's homegrown, that's how we will survive the state structure. So I think we just have to be careful in terms of how external support is kind of provided to these movements. Probably, maybe not even provide any support if that's what it comes to.
They may very well be the most sensible approaches to not engage, and then think very deeply about how you engage with movements. Nadine?
I think I already said what I mean. I'm in support of capacity, thinking broadly about capacity, and in particular, figuring out how to mentor and coach without taking leadership away from people on the ground for the groups that are coming in, and looking to make sure to help the non-dominant voices, as were mentioned, really have a space at the table.
Thank you. Now we have a healthy, let's see, almost 20 minutes to hear from you all. Questions, comments. If you could identify yourself and be brief, that would be great. So we'll do 3 at a time. How's that? So we'll start here, please. Do we have mic runners? Or how are we doing with mics? Well, I think we're recording this, so it's probably better for you to speak in the... Lisa, thank you.
All right, can you, yep, sounds right. So my name is Nagar Abai. I work with the Baha'i community in the United States, and thank you so much for this invaluable work. I recognize that the particular focus here is nonviolent action and peace processes, but my question is sort of in our expanded understanding of sustaining peace, of positive peace, of the various conversations around that, is there also room for an expanded understanding of nonviolent action that brings more into it sort of the constructive project and outside particular conflict as we understand it, kind of long-endured oppression, which may be, I think, some of the reflections of the U.S. As sort of aspects of the civil rights movement that involved, prefigurative politics and, just other things that were created, other insights and forms of institutions. What role is there in our kind of analysis?
Great, thank you. Over here.
My name is Kelsey Coolidge. I'm from the War Prevention Initiative and the Peace Science Digest. And the aim of the digest is to make peace science more applicable to practitioners and policymakers in these kind of contexts. So I'm curious about how would you go about the application of academic research in your work, looking from, on one hand, those who participate in these type of movements. Does academic research embolden causes or inform strategies, for example? And then from the perspective of the researchers, do they or should they wait until they have generalizable results or meet some sort of gold standard of RCTs or replication? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna go up here.
Thank you. I'm Tucker Stillman from New Gen Peacebuilders. I had 2 questions for Paul Washa. I was going to say, first, can you elaborate more on youth involvement in politics in Afghan and whether female youth get the same opportunities as male youth? And then in a time where there's a push for youth involvement, how can youth have an impact on a religious aspect when the leaders tend to be adults?
Okay, so is there room for expanded notions of nonviolent action to include constructive program prefigurative work? Nadine, that might be a good one for you. And then how to engage academic research more effectively. Maybe we could start with Veronique. And then on the youth, maybe Paul Washa. But everyone can feed into all the questions. But Nadine?
Yes. I mean, I think it's kind of a funny thing that in the United States, we do seem to have a division of people understanding what Gandhi called constructive program, prefigurative work, or what we call creating the future now in regular terms. Prefigurative work is we have this big argument about this term, prefigurative, because it already puts you in the realm of academics. What the hell is prefigurative? Just build it now. Okay, so anyway, so yes, this is an ongoing conversation, and it's not as divided in the whole world as it is here in the U.S. or potentially in this room. And I will say, there are incredible stories of constructive programs and building the future now that are in some ways resistant in and of themselves or create impact business as usual in and of themselves. But there are also ones that operate sort of under the context, don't make so many waves. And on purpose this happens, right? In the United States, we have a long tradition of black farmers running cooperative businesses to support their work under the radar of typical mainstream U.S. agencies because they didn't want to be disrupted in the work that they were doing. They weren't interested, they didn't feel that they had the strategic power to disrupt the mainstream business association, so they went underneath and instead created this alternative. On the other hand, just recently, there's many examples. For example, we could talk about the KXL pipeline and the building of a solar-powered barn right on the route of the proposed pipeline, embodying the future that we want as an act of blockade. Right there. So there's a huge spectrum of things that have happened and are happening here in the United States and around the world on this level. And there is also a whole new configuring of Gene Sharp's 198 methods. Michael Beer wrote a piece that I believe is published now by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and helps us envision and use categories that are absolutely much more effective in understanding the spectrum of activities that we can engage in, from constructive program to disruptive program. And that is also in the SNAP guide. And I'll just have to say this because I'm here. And it's free online, right? So it's not like we're promoting you're buying anything. So here also, you can buy these books, but also this material from Beautiful Trouble and Beautiful Rising is free online as well, and really covers the spectrum of creative strategic action, including a sister project of ours called Beautiful Solutions, which in particular focuses on this constructive work. So thank you for asking that question.
Great.
On research, where was the question coming? Yeah, over there. Well, I mean, yeah, it's a good and tricky question. Like in my research, for instance, I'm looking at 6 cases. So how can one generalize? And I think it reminds me of the need to be humble about what really we can say is there or isn't there. I think one thing to say is that for me, it shows the importance of doing participatory research, where what I'm trying to do is not to have this external look and kind of look objectively what worked, what didn't work, but asking activists to self-reflect on the choices they make, the consequences, and then their reflections afterwards, 10 years later, 20 years later, which I think for me has more value than trying to have a scientific product. Also, the importance of using mixed methods, and we have a follow-up project where we're going to have a mix of quantitative and qualitative data, which maybe goes more into the having valid results. And I think combine these having more qualitative but very agency-based approaches, and having more scientific approaches is I think what works best in the end.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So on youth involvement, in terms of your question about whether women are involved at the same level, so particularly on the People's Peace Movement, or the Helmand Peace March, that was men, although the women spurred it and they had tents, and there were different places where women were supportive. They weren't the marchers themselves. But the other movements that I mentioned, the Tabassum movement, the Enlightenment movement, the Uprising for Change movement, there were women involved, young women involved in these movements. A lot of the protests were happening in Kabul and other major cities. So you had that. I mean, that could be said that, it's more urban youth that were involved in these movements. So you do see that difficulty in terms of rural versus urban, and what spaces women, young women, feel comfortable participating in, and also the evolutions of the movement. So we saw that towards the end, where they had the tents and things got kind of dicey with security, there weren't a lot of women present. It was mostly young men that were present in those situations. So women do have a role. They have raised their voice, and they do take to the streets. And there have been a number of protests, peace protests by women on International Peace Day, on International Women's Day, where women themselves will take. It will be only women protests in Afghanistan, so that does happen as well. So the youth, it's a different dynamic than with the youth and with the elders. You do see more women participating, and that's been interesting to see that space opening up. In terms of youth in the religious aspect of things, so it depends on what you're looking at. In terms of those that organized for the fatwa, it was the scholars, the elders that were sort of in the lead, but that doesn't mean that youth didn't have a role, because there were conversations and consensus building in the madrasas where mostly they're youth that are present. So that's one aspect of it. And then if you look at the rural radicalization movements, youth are very much involved in those, and as we've seen, it doesn't require scholarship. You can see that youth have led more fundamentalist uprisings at the local level that are also in reaction to the government. So religion can, you have that youth and religion can be on both sides, and their roles it's different depending on what the conversation is about and what role the youth and the religious leaders are playing.
Thanks, Pawasha. Adi, did you want to chime in before we go to round two? Or? Okay.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Roig from Partners Global. And Nadine and Maria know that I'm super interested in these leaderful movements and the concept of a facilitation stakeholder, or a stakeholder within the movement that's legitimate, but does play that role of facilitating those strategic conversations, or at least the conflict resolution that has to happen within, and who enters to play that role in a legitimate way inside the movement, or at least inside the country. And if you haven't seen the SNAP guide, I do highly recommend it, because there's a whole section on there about the importance of facilitation. But I'm really curious, maybe in the case of Afghanistan and Ethiopia, were there facilitators who were legitimate within the role that helped kind of organize conversations even amidst the chaos? Because that's how the Partners Network is really trying to position its work. Thank you.
Hi, Bo Wilcox from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. I would love to unpack more about the specific point on the lessons learned slide, specifically mediators maybe doing too much on the ground for social change, and then that may affect the entire negotiation process negatively. Could the panel just provide maybe some examples of where they've seen mediation gone in maybe a negative direction and it's changed the stuff or the situation on the ground? And just adding another layer, has this fed into why certain governments don't bring these movement groups into negotiations with armed groups as well? Thank you.
My name is Bina, and I'm from the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network, located in the Indo-Burma border. My question is to Dr. Veronique. Veronique, I would like to know how many conflicts did you study for bringing that analysis up? I come from the state of Manipur, which is one of the longest running conflicts in the world, but my country, India, hides it from the world. That's why you would have not known about this region. 50,000 killed, 300,000 paramilitary troops, and Kashmir and Northeast are the two regions in India where we have a martial law since 1958. So in terms of, we have a phenomena called a war within a war phenomena. So in that, how does peace process, which is over a 70-year-old conflict, come about or not come about? The analysis of that. And my final question is in terms of, we know we have $1.8 trillion spent annually by governments around the world on war. How much money have we calculated for spending on peace? Because it's so important. We may talk about peace and beautiful work and the courage that we have, but I feel that we haven't done enough to get the resource we want to be able to get the peace that is residing. And finally, we are talking about, I come from a place where a woman has done a 15-year-old hunger strike, Irom Sharmila. Then we have young children, like young adults like Greta Thunberg. Now I'm talking about a people's power which is becoming like one person centered. So what is the solution like? And when those icons go, what happens to movements? When Irom Sharmila left hunger strike, it was as if we have lost the movement against the martial law. So how do we galvanize these icons with mass movements? How do we ensure that we spend enough for peace? And have we calculated that? These are what we, and in a time of rising authoritarian regimes, I feel that our movements have to be stronger, strategic, and more practical than just that we love peace.
Thank you. So the questions were about facilitation stakeholders, rogue mediators, and war within a war, how peace processes work in those cases, and how to galvanize mass movements beyond kind of charismatic leaders. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I think this might be the last round of questions, but we'll see. Who wants to go first?
So the negotiation one, I think, well, it's what we mentioned. I think it's difficult when you come into negotiation process, you come representing a particular group. That's how negotiation works. You have to have a particular, and the negotiation is always a very narrow. It's not democratic process. It's either you're armed and you come to the table, or you have other movements. So I think it's very difficult for government, especially for the leaderless. And I know there's the problem with that. But if you don't have a structure or something like that that's not visible to the government, it's very difficult for you to come to the negotiation table. So one is that. Secondly, I think there's something sinister about negotiations, because you come into negotiation to always kind of try to win something. I think that's how kind of negotiations work. You're trying to either outsmart the opposition or something like that. So I think for governments, I think it's difficult for them to deal with movements, because you're representing broader, it's a broad movement, so many interests, but also many other kind of, the issues even that you bring to the table are kind of some things that might not necessarily be addressed in a negotiation process. Because negotiation, as we understand, is things are always narrowed down, and then the process itself is something that you follow up. So my suggestion is actually not for them to enter the negotiation process. It's more of what comes after, which is where you discuss the whole reconciliation, the social changes, the institutional movements that comes afterwards, how you actually benefit from that. And it comes back to the point I was making earlier about the space and the time. I don't think it's in the interest of these movements to actually be part of a negotiation process, because it's kind of very political. Sometimes even some of these leaders are very childish in how they negotiate. Sometimes you spend, I remember in our process, spending 3 days talking about the name of this region and trying to figure out, and we were saying, but your constitution actually says something else for the government. So you spend a lot of time actually talking about what will sound to an external as a non-issue, but it's actually symbolic for the pattern. So so that's about the negotiation. The thing about the charismatic leaders, I think, is what we I think it depends on kind of the context. In the Ethiopia case, I think, as I said, the reason why there wasn't the leaders that were visible was in response to the crackdown that the government had previously. So I mean, yeah, if you have a leader who is visible, I think it makes process of kind of negotiating or putting the issues on the table much easier, and it's easier for the government to engage with them. But then you create the problem that you were saying. It's like if you lose that person, then things will disappear, and then you don't know where to start from. Yeah, so.
Well, thank you, Adam. So I'll ask the three panelists to give 1 minute of summary remarks that attempt to address some of the questions that were just posed. Nadine, you want to start? Or Veronique? Go ahead.
Okay. Facilitation within movements, super important, and I know that we are discussing as part of the SNAP how to expand some of these parts on looking at roles like insider mediators and facilitators and negotiations within, very important. Examples of mediators affecting the power on the ground. I mean, I've found a number of examples, and I don't want to be criticizing my peers, but maybe the one that will be in the report and I can cite is how the HD Center in Aceh intervened and were told by the government, well, you have to talk only to the armed groups. And they were like, well, either we don't intervene or we go along with that. So that they did. And the armed groups were too happy to be seen as those that represent civil society and not to want to invite the movements. But in such a case, the activists told me before that process, we were seen, like the SIRA student-led movement, we were seen as the center of gravity of the struggle. After that process, we became seen as one among many others, and the armed rebels were representing the movement. So definitely there was an impact there. And thank you so much for bringing that story from Manipur. And I think this is, I forgot to mention before, one of the roles of researchers is to bring to light these stories, to collect them, and to use them for training purposes, so that whenever our colleagues going on the ground and doing trainings, they can bring these stories, very powerful ones, or very sad ones as well. So that it can inspire and enlighten. So I'm hoping that even if I'm only looking at 6 cases, I can also help to bring these stories, and that it can also be a living project that continues to bring them.
Great. Thank you.
So in reflecting on the women's movement in Afghanistan and how full of leaders they are and how they are my sheroes, they're amazing. But you know, there are times when they have differing opinions and don't get along. And it's been interesting to see the dynamic of how some of them recognize and will just take on that role of mediating and coming in between. And we've had some really great examples of women just taking that on and working to build those relationships. Some relationships that have gone sour because of different issues have been working to build those relationships throughout the last few years. And it's really helped bring the women together to be able to, even though they have a diversity of opinion, to be able to work together and have a unified front when they do confront and try and engage in the peace process. So they've been able to do that, and I can talk offline about some of those dynamics, but there's some really incredible things that have happened there. In terms of mediators, the thing that came to mind was something that happened earlier this year when the Qataris were trying to host peace talks, intra-Afghan peace talks, and the Afghan political parties had a hard time coming up with names, and everybody wanted to be part of it because they all felt they needed to be there in order to not lose whatever power they had. And the women were helping to bring them to the table, and it ended up being this huge long list of something like 255 names that were then proposed to go to the intra-Afghan talks with the Taliban delegation. And the government had been part of this, so the government had also proposed names, and there were non-governmental included, political leaders were included, opposition leaders were included. When this got to Qatar, the person who they had appointed to mediate this conversation had then consulted with the Taliban, unbeknownst to the government, and had rejected names on the list that the government had worked so hard to come up with this consensus building about who could go and talk at this place, and so the whole thing fell apart. So unfortunately, that didn't happen. There was intra-Afghan talks later on, but that was a good example of something that didn't work in terms of the role of the mediator. And in terms of galvanizing movements, I remember the Iraqi women and the Afghan women were talking to each other. USIP had this dialogue between the two of them, and the Iraqi women said, "Wow, we need to learn from you about how we should not fall asleep at the wheel." And so it's learning from not just what's in your country or in your own movement, but from movements around you to help keep you awake and not fall asleep at the wheel.
Great, thanks, Palwasha. And this is probably a very dangerous thing to say, but Nadine, you have the last word.
I guess I have four really quick things I'll say. One is we have a great story of facilitation, appropriate facilitation, if you will, during one of our SNAP trainings between different sectors of the Nicaraguan struggle that was facilitated by Colombians who were also at the same training. So an intra-movement conversation around implicit bias, actually, and oppressions that were part of the culture. And actually, that's one of the things I wanted to say is that one of the things that we need to work on and that education and training can really help address across the fields of nonviolent action and peace building is looking at implicit bias and cultural limitations that we bring into the work that really limit our numbers and then limit our effectiveness. I really want to dig into this question about the strategic question about what do movements need to do to be recognized and what's appropriate, what's safe, what's effective in all these different frameworks that we work in. And the answer of really being able to say that what we want is to be present at the on-the-ground problem solving, the reconciliation pieces, what's happening as the next levels of government structures and things get set up. And the implementation of solutions is really a really fruitful conversation, I think, to have. And then the last thing I'm going to say is that this, to me, is all about this synergizing nonviolent action and peace building, the understanding people power on the ground is all about what we can do to support people taking ever greater risk for the more peaceful, more just, more healthy future that we all want and we all deserve. So what does that look like? And for me, the answer is training and education.
Awesome. That's a great way to end the panel. Thank you all. Thank you to this amazing panel, and enjoy the rest of the conference.